Operas, ballets, films, and musicals by such greats as George Frederick Handel and Richard Strauss all bear his name. He's revered by Jewish, Christian, Islamic, and even Baha'i faithful. Your kids probably know him best from the classic VeggieTales video, The Ballad of Little Joe. Well, join us today as we explore the remarkable life and legacy of Joseph the Patriarch. Welcome to the Shalom Y'all Ministries podcast. I'm your co-host, Adam Keim, along with my dear friend, Dr. Daniel McCabe. Daniel, how are you doing these days?
Adam, doing fine. I sure have missed you the last couple of podcasts. Thanks for filling in for me. Our schedules just didn't seem to be able to mesh for those two recordings, but I'm well, so I hope our viewers don't have any concerns about that. But it's good to be with you again today.
Oh, good. I'm glad to be back at it together as well. And we here at Shalom Y'all trust that a walk through the land deepens your walk with the Lord. Our mission here is to teach and encourage those who love the Bible, the land of the Bible, and the people of the land. In addition to our teaching ministries, Shalom Y'all loves traveling to Israel and taking you with us. Maybe someday we can be in the promised land together. Reach out for more information on how you or your group can take a trip with us when the time is right. And as we do with each episode, we begin with a couple of mini topics before we get into our main subject matter of the Patriarch Joseph. Daniel, what do you have to lead off for us today?
You know, Adam, I want to begin with a story from the New Testament. There's a good chance you know the story of the widow praised by Jesus in the temple for giving an offering of 2 mites, which Mark explains in 1242 of his gospel, which makes a quadrans, he says. Now, in the next 2 verses, Jesus tells his disciples, well, this poor widow has put in more than all those who have given to the treasury, for they all put in out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, put in all that she had. You know, although fairly well known as the widow's mite, the original Greek text of the Bible calls her coins 2 leptons. A lepton being something small or thin. In other words, the widow put in 2 small coins, is the idea. Now, Mark doesn't give the specific name of the coins, only that they were small. Writing to a Roman audience who wouldn't have been familiar with the specific Jewish coins used by the widow, Mark compares her coins to one of their Roman coins, the quadrans. And when Jerome, an early Christian scholar, translated the Greek New Testament into Latin around 400 AD, he called the widow's 2 coins duo minuta, the word from which we get minute, something very small. A common abbreviation for minuta is mite, so voila, that's where the term mite originated. First stamped and issued during the reign of Alexander Jannaeus, king of Judea, between 103 and I guess about 76 BC. The bronze mite, similar to our penny, it was the smallest coin circulating in Jerusalem in Jesus' day. On one side of the coin, it commonly depicted an 8-rayed star, and on the other side, it would feature the king's name as well as an anchor. I didn't research, not sure what the meaning of the coin's markings are, but you know, the next time you come to Israel with our ministry, I can take you to several reputable coin dealers in Israel who'd be glad to sell you an authentic widow's mite. How does that sound, Adam?
Yeah, sounds great to me. You know, they do have a lot of things. You know, you can buy things like widow's mites and Roman glass and all sorts of stuff that are left over from the Roman times where you would think, oh, how did they get that? You know, it's amazing something has lasted for that long, and it is. But you go to Israel and widow's mites and Roman glass and stuff like that is kind of
everywhere,
kind of all over the place, because it was all over the place in that day. And where else is it? It's not going to disappear. You know, it's going to be under the ground. And as they dig anywhere, they're digging up all sorts of pottery shards and coins and stuff like that. It's pretty cool.
Right, and they've got lots left to dig, so there are going to be plenty of them for long to come, I would imagine.
Yes. Well, Daniel, you know what today is, April 15th?
I know, I've been working on them.
Oh, good, good, good. Well, it is, of course, the traditional tax day in the United States when your annual income taxes are due. And that is something that is all too real for all of us. But, you wonder what were taxes like in biblical times? The famous phrase, two things are sure in life, death and taxes, right?
Yes.
Taxes have been a reality for humanity forever. Now, the taxation situation was a bit different in every region and every time frame, no matter depending on which kingdom or empire was in power. So let's look at a little bit about it during Jesus's day in Israel. And one of the many forms of taxation that there was owed to the local town. Jewish authorities levied taxes for generally beneficial purposes, such as the maintenance of synagogues, roads, city walls, schools, support for the poor, and so on. And generally speaking, the burden of these taxes was administered kindly and gently from Jew to Jew. Roman taxation, however, was typically cruel and burdensome. The patience of everyone was often tried as even bales of hay were unloaded and searched through, and personal letters were opened and read by authorities. And there were onerous income and property taxes, and censuses were carried out to ensure that every bit of money was exacted from the population. And these censuses were likely despised by the Jews, since, well, if in the old days it was sinful to do such a thing, bad for even King David of all people, then to be subjected to a census by a heathen emperor like Caesar was far, far worse. So the question that was often asked, is it lawful to pay tribute to Caesar, became quite a common challenge and a very sore question to each Israelite as he forked over more and more money all the time for every little thing that could be taxed. That is why the Pharisees asked that question of Jesus in order to trap him in a sort of political denunciation. Well, it's no wonder then that Jews who joined up with Roman authorities in the profession of tax collecting became so hated by their own countrymen. Those tax collectors were called publicani, which is the Latin term for them. So think of Zacchaeus in Luke 19, the man in Jericho to whom Jesus invited himself over to stay with. Zacchaeus was so moved that he promised to restore fourfold to anyone whom he defrauded. It was very common for these tax collectors to do things like artificially inflate property and income value to extract more taxes, or to even advance the tax onto those who they knew couldn't pay it and then charge outrageous interest penalties. So when Zacchaeus repented of this, Jesus considered him a true son of Abraham. So I sure hope that y'all have your taxes paid up. I really don't think Jesus is too much interested in freeing you from that earthly burden, as he wasn't when the Pharisees asked him if it was lawful to render taxes unto Caesar. But like Zacchaeus, you can be freed from a much heavier and consequential burden, the weight of sin that so easily entangles us. Daniel, what is this week's trivia question?
Okay, well, Jews worldwide will be soon celebrating the Passover. This year it's on April 22nd, my brown eyed sister's birthday, and that's 1 week from today.
Mm-hmm.
Jewish families, they're going to gather in their homes to remember how God delivered their forefathers from Egypt, right? And one of their Passover traditions, Adam, it includes a meal called a Seder. That's a presentation we do here regularly at Shalom Y'all Ministries and go from churches to churches and lead Seders for the groups. And they have a meal annually, usually overseen by the head of the home, the father. And within this meal, they highlight different food items that are used to tell the story of the first Passover almost 3,500 years ago. You're very familiar with all that, aren't you, Adam?
Yeah, fairly.
Yeah, okay. Although there are differences among how Seders are prepared, which of the following is not commonly found on a Passover Seder table? Now, this part might be a tricky even for you, Adam.
Yeah, I'm concerned about it because when you ask me, you know a fair bit about I know about the Old Testament content. I have to
Yes,
admit, I'm not as familiar with the
correct.
details of the Seder
Yes,
feast
I
as I
know you
should.
know the story well, but this might be a little trickier. Yeah. So, which of the following is not commonly found on a Passover Seder table? I'll give out the options to you, and you can secretly check Google between now and the end of the podcast if you need to. But here are your four choices. I'll narrow it down at least this much for you. Here are four things, one of which is not on the Passover Seder table. Is it A, matzah? Is it B, lamb meat? Is it C, horseradish? Or is it D, parsley? Matzah, lamb meat, horseradish, or parsley? Think that one over, and we'll have the answer for you later in the podcast.
Joseph, one of Jacob's 12 sons and thus a patriarch of the people of Israel, was a fascinating person. One thing about him that stands out in Scripture is that, if you think about it, nothing truly bad is ever recorded about him. In this regard, I think of people like Samuel, John the Baptist, and even the other Joseph, the earthly father of Jesus. Well, okay, John the Baptist did send his disciples to question if Jesus really was the Christ, but Jesus defended John to the crowds and did not denunciate the Baptist's faith. And the only possibly negative thing mentioned about Samuel, I suppose, was that he mourned too much over Saul being rejected as king over Israel. And the closest bad thing that we have with Joseph the Patriarch was when he told his brothers about the dream he had in which they would bow down to him. A dream, by the way, which just simply foretold the truth. Now, we don't know Joseph's attitude about it. If he was being prideful and boastful, then that was wrong. But maybe it was innocent, and he was only guilty of not being sensitive enough to their feelings. And some might consider Joseph many years later toying with his brothers in Egypt before finally revealing his identity and forgiving them. And that would be kind of mean, also, I suppose. But even then, I don't think he was necessarily trying to mess with them and being too harsh. But at the end of the day, we do not have a specific sin recorded about him. Not that he was perfect, because all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But the thing that really strikes me about Joseph is how he remained faithful to God in the hardest of situations. And even better, how God remained faithful to him in those times as well. And when Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, we read something remarkable in Genesis 39, verses 1 through 6. I'll read those for you now. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. But the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. And he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him an overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had, in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. Did something jump out to you there? Now think about verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph. If we were to read on, we would discover that Joseph, through no fault of his own, again, ended up losing his job and getting thrown in prison by a completely manufactured charge by Potiphar's wife. When tempted by her, Joseph wound up getting in trouble by doing the right thing, fleeing from sin. So let's read verses 20 to 23. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. Think about the lowest points in Joseph's life. And what does the Bible say in those times? The Lord was with him. Now, one might say, well, if the Lord was with him, he would not have been sold into slavery or thrown into prison in the first place. Oh, really? Well, how did Joseph himself evaluate those troubles in his life? After he rose to power in Egypt, he said to his brothers in Genesis 45, verses 7 through 8, "And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God." And in chapter 50, verse 20, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." And of course, if you know the story very well, uh, a great famine came in the land of Canaan. So Jacob and his family moved to Egypt, which Joseph then was already in place and in great power to care for them. And that was all in God's greater plan. So you see, Joseph, I think, is the shining example of what it looks like to have God with you in all times of life, no matter your circumstances. The Apostle Paul said in Philippians 4:9 that the God of peace will be with us. And Jesus said in Matthew 28:20 that he is with us always. The path that God used to provide for his people in Egypt, in the greater scheme of history, ran right through Joseph languishing for a time in slavery and prison. He understood that, and so must we. So, are you enduring a hardship right now? Probably. We all do at many times. And remember the example of Joseph, that right in the midst of his greatest trials, the Lord was with him. God did not deliver him from slavery or free him from prison right away. He led Joseph into that trouble and carried him through it. God even blessed him greatly out of those impossible circumstances. And do you notice what Joseph's reaction was in those hard times? He did not try to run away from them. Sure, he did not want to be in slavery or in prison. Who would? But he made the most out of a bad situation. He did what he had to do and served faithfully, like Daniel did in Babylon and Persia. A lot of people might think that's weak. Like any good action movie, Joseph should have had the courage to bust out and make his own way to freedom. But that's not how he reacted. He understood the reality of his circumstances, and he made the most out of them, the best that he could. So what the right reaction is in any given trial might look differently from person to person. Joseph made that choice to not try to break out of prison or flee from slavery. So again, what the right reaction is might differ from person to person, so long as the choice is not sinful. But regardless of any of it, Joseph endured with faith, and most importantly, the Lord was with him as he is with you.
Well, let me tie my remarks directly into so many of the things you said. It's hard not to notice what an amazing man Joseph was, a man of integrity. Well, let's go back to the beginning. Shortly before his death, or the death of Jacob, rather, Joseph's father, Jacob called all of his sons. He had 12 of them. He called his sons to his side to tell them really quite plainly what would become of their life and legacy. So all his sons are there at Jacob's side. Simeon and Levi were there, and they were summarily denounced for their anger and cruelty in the past. And Reuben, Jacob's oldest son would be described as unstable and was told he'd accomplish little during his lifetime. Jacob likened Issachar to a donkey, Dan to a serpent, and Benjamin to a wolf. I mean, it must have been really tough to hear their dad straight talk that day. Although not everything Jacob said was hard to hear, because Joseph, he said, would be a fruitful vine, flourishing alongside a spring, whose branches would climb over the wall. That's how Jacob, Joseph's father, put it in Genesis 49:22. It's a beautiful promise that prompted a well-known writer named Harold Wilmington, who's now with the Lord. And in his masterful work, Wilmington's Guide to the Bible, he described Joseph and his legacy as, quote, the fruitful shade tree. I like that. I certainly wouldn't mind for my legacy to be that of a fruitful shade tree. And I think that's a great description of Joseph's life. Observing Joseph's dependence on the Lord in your remarks, the things you highlighted, Adam, and the things I picked up on. We see this dependence upon the Lord that is so strong in his life. And I think the writer, Moses, is trying to teach us and to motivate us to be the same. And he wants us, like Joseph, to flourish next to God's spring of blessings and climb great heights that please the Lord. And so the story of Joseph is a monumental story and one of great encouragement to us all. It begins back in Genesis chapter 37 with these words. This is where we first are introduced to Joseph. And it says, Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers. Verse 2. Now Joseph will quickly spread out his branches, quote, in the land of Canaan, verse 1, until finally we read in the very last verse of the book of Genesis, Genesis 50:26, so Joseph died, being 110 years old, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. So let's take in the whole story now of Joseph's life from 17 to 110, from Canaan to Egypt, and from Genesis 37 all the way to Genesis 50. We see Joseph's fruitful shade tree first planted, and then we see it in so much of what you said earlier, Adam. We see it survive through storm and drought, maybe spiritual drought, we could say, certainly physical drought. And none of this seemed to be any of his makings, best I can tell. And then we see this shade tree spread out its branches, and they're strong branches. Branches made strong, it tells us in Genesis 49:24 and 25, by, quote, the hands of the mighty God of Jacob, who, Moses goes on to record Jacob's word and of Joseph, in which he says, the mighty God of Jacob will help you, Joseph, and bless you with blessings of heaven above and blessings of the deep that lie beneath. Amazing word pictures that suggest the blessings enjoyed by Joseph came because he stayed close to God through every season of his life. And that's our charge as well, of course. Now, Wilmington summarizes Joseph's story from Genesis 37 to 50 in this way. He calls Joseph the favored son, chapter 37. He calls him the faithful steward, chapter 39. The forgotten servant, chapter 40, from his days in prison. The famed and forgiving statesman, chapters 41 to 44. The forgiving saint, chapters 45 to 48. And then finally, he describes 49 to 50, chapters 49 through 50, as I said earlier, Joseph is the fruitful shade tree. Now, what's interesting about Wilmington's outline, and really by any outline of Joseph's life for that matter, is that Joseph goes from favored son in chapter 37 to faithful steward in chapter 39, with the narrative skipping over chapter 38 entirely. Chapter 38 doesn't mention Joseph at all. It only mentions Judah, one of Joseph's older brothers, who had a very unusual encounter with Tamar, his daughter-in-law. So you kind of have to ask yourself, what's this chapter doing then of Judah and Tamar? What's this chapter doing in the middle of the story of Joseph? Chapter 38 seems entirely out of place. And some believe that that it was just sort of placed there by the editors of the Bible in a haphazard way. But then you really come to realize that it's an intentional insertion by Moses of a parallel story that shows a striking contrast between the deceit and immorality of Judah and the integrity and purity of Joseph. And it really further serves to reinforce your point, Adam, earlier that Joseph is presented consistently in Scripture as a godly man and as a fit example for imitation. Whereas Judah slept with a woman who he believed to be a harlot. Joseph, on the other hand, in the very next chapter, refuses to sleep with his boss's wife despite her advances toward him. So, chapter 38 is a lesson in contrast. Now, William Taylor draws the following three faith lessons from this chapter in the life of Joseph, these early days, and of course, also from the tragic consequences that Joseph experienced simply for doing what is right, as you pointed out, Adam. And Taylor writes this, and I like what he says. He says, quote, "We may learn then in the first place that when we have unusual blessing in someone's life, we may look for severe temptation. But we may learn from this history in the second place that when temptation takes us, we must resist it with a strong and decided no, and carefully take ourselves out of its range. But we may learn in the third place that we should not be surprised to find that our adherence to the right is followed at first by great hardship." Now, in Joseph's case, wrongful imprisonment, but we see statements by writers in the New Testament that promise us, if that's the right word, that if we walk as committed believers, we'll face hardships. And we don't like to read that, but there it is, because the Lord uses these events to grow us. But as we continue to read through the story and the life of Joseph, we're pleased to learn that he's eventually freed from prison, and beyond all expectations, he is elevated to the second most powerful leadership position in Egypt. And I think there's a promise also in so many New Testament scriptures that don't promise us that we'll be able to overcome hardships in this life, but certainly on the other side of this life. You know, in his book, Knowing God's classic by J.I. Packer, you've probably read it. Most young seminarians once in the past, like you and I, were probably introduced to this book. But J.I. Packer, he summarizes this remarkable turn of events in Joseph's life as follows. He says, quote, "The action of God in taking Joseph from prison to become Pharaoh's prime minister is a picture of what God does to every Christian. From being Satan's prisoner, he finds himself transferred to a position of trust in the service of God, and at once life is transformed," writes Packer. But others have noticed that not only do the circumstances of Joseph's life picture God's work in the life of every Christian, as Packer just mentioned, but also his life, Joseph's life, shows striking similarities, comparisons to our Savior Jesus. For example, both Joseph and Jesus were beloved by their fathers, and I could give you scriptures for each one of this. Genesis 37:3, for example, compared to Matthew 3:17. Both Joseph and Jesus were sent by their fathers to their brethren. They were both hated by their brethren without a cause, both betrayed by their brethren, both stripped of their robes, both sold for the price of a slave, both taken for a time into Egypt, both severely tempted, both falsely accused, and so many more comparisons. It's remarkable. Joseph, the fruitful shade tree, points us to Jesus in so many ways. And may his legacy be our legacy. That the Lord was, as you pointed out so beautifully, Adam, that the Lord was with him, that Joseph walked with the Lord all his days. All right, now earlier I asked a question about the Passover and the traditional Passover meal celebrated annually by Jews worldwide. And there are differences among how Seders are prepared. But I asked this question. Let's see if you're ready now. Which of the following is not commonly found on a Passover Seder table? Is it matzah, lamb meat, horseradish, or parsley? All right, I don't mean to put you on the spot, Adam, but what do you think?
All right, here we go. So many of the trivia questions get me hungry. This is no exception. You know a lot more about the Seder
A little.
meal and stuff like this than I do, so I'm only marginally confident
Okay.
in my answer. I might be wrong, but I
But
think
you know what, Adam, I'll say this. The fact that you sometimes struggle with these trivia questions, and behind the scenes, I've told you many, many times, I'm sure glad it's the other way around because I would struggle mightily. I just don't recall things as well as you do. But the fact that even you and I struggle with some of these questions, I think in some way encourages our readers to realize, yeah, there's a lot to learn, and we're still learning too.
Oh, absolutely. There's so much to learn, and and it's so true. The more you know you don't know. The more
Yes.
you realize there's so much that we just can't know everything. But I'm taking a guess at this one. I
Okay.
don't know for sure, but I think it's one of these things. It's like you would think this would be part of it, but it's kind of a tricky question. So like the other things like horseradish and parsley that most people might not think of, I'm thinking are probably part of it because it might be one of the other obvious ones that isn't. Now, I really think lamb is part of it. And so I started thinking lamb, I think is, and I think I know horseradish is. And then I started getting really hungry and I just started thinking about lamb and horseradish. But you know what? It's between parsley and bread for me. But I think parsley is one of those. Why would it not? Why would you throw that in there? I know you could throw anything because you're crafty, you're tricky, you like the snake in the garden, Daniel.
Yeah,
I'm just kidding.
whatever.
I'm gonna go with. I'm gonna say matzo bread.
All right. Well, you're not right. But I love the
Uh,
way you thought about it because it's like sometimes it's the very thing that you think would be that isn't, and in this
yeah.
case, it's actually lamb meat.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yes. So they do have the shank bone of a lamb on the Seder plate, but they don't actually eat lamb
Oh,
for
they
the
just have the
Passover
bone there.
Seder. Ever since the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, 40 years or so, roughly after Jesus died. The Romans came in. You've told this story many times. You've even written half a novel, I think, on the topic. But when the Romans came in and destroyed the Jerusalem temple in AD 70, it ended the sacrifices at the
Yes, it
temple.
did.
And so
Of
then they
course.
don't bring to their Passover Seder meal anymore. They don't bring the lamb because they can't sacrifice the lamb at the temple anymore. So
Well, there you
matzah
go.
is there, horseradish or some other common bitter herb is
Bitter
there,
root, right?
bitter
Yeah.
root, bitter herb, yeah. And then the parsley is pretty traditional, but the lamb meat is not. How about
Mm,
that?
good one.
Yeah.
I'm still hungry for it.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna tell you that the horseradish, the bitter herb that is included in the Passover meal, it's meant to highlight the bitterness of the slavery of the Jews in Egypt.
Hmm.
So the very first time I had a Seder for my family, and I had My children dip the matzah bread into the horseradish, which it's intended to make you kind of go, whoa, that's awful. That's bitter. And one of my boys bit in the horseradish, never having had it before, took it on his matzah, dipped some on there, took it and went in the middle of the Seder. He said, "Dad, this is great."
What a refined young man. Yes. Horseradish is great. I agree.
So it's supposed to symbolize bitterness, but for him, it was great joy nonetheless. Well,
And that's what the Lord does. He turns our bitterness to
amen.
joy, like Naomi,
Yeah.
right?
Well, some of you may be wondering when we will again be leading tours to Israel. And we're wondering that, I guess, to some degree ourselves.
Yes, we
Well, I
are.
want to quote Abraham Lincoln. Can I do that?
And please do.
All right. Abraham Lincoln once said, "How I should like to visit Jerusalem sometime."
Mm-hmm.
Well, our 16th president never made it to Jerusalem in his lifetime, but perhaps your sometime can be very soon. With the war still raging, it doesn't seem likely that we'll be able to organize a group until at least the end of this year, but that doesn't have to keep you from planning a trip for 2025. And we do, in fact, have at least 2 closed trips scheduled for next year. But I would recommend that you contact us at Shalom Y'all Ministries at gmail.com. No spaces, no apostrophes, just Shalom Y'all Ministries at gmail.com. And let's at least pencil in some dates for 2025 or beyond. If the war persists or your plans were to change, we can always bump your trip a little further down the road, but get it down on paper and we'll have something to be working towards. And it would be our great joy, always, it would be our great joy to lead you one day to the promised land. And we hope that day is very, very soon.
Amen to that. Well, we hope that you have enjoyed this discussion about Joseph. I think you can see some similarities between his life and yours. Now, you may not have experienced the same harsh conditions that he did, but you have the same opportunity to trust in the Lord and let him carry you through every trial and temptation. Shalom, y'all.
Shalom, y'all.